Before songs were ever lifted in triumph and before victory found a voice, there existed a fragile pause in history, a breath that hovered between despair and deliverance. It was a time when hope appeared reckless, when confidence felt misplaced, and when even seasoned warriors questioned the worth of courage. Strength stood present, yet fear held dominion, wrapping itself around the hearts of men trained for battle. Silence became heavier than armor. Shields rested unused. Words of bravery dissolved before reaching the lips. The ground itself seemed to wait, bearing witness to a standoff shaped not by blades but by dread. What unfolded next would not merely determine the outcome of a conflict, it would redefine the meaning of power. This is not simply the telling of a giant's downfall. It is the revealing of how faith steps forward when reason retreats, how trust in the unseen rises when all visible paths collapse. While armies trembled and a crowned king lingered in hesitation, God prepared an unlikely instrument. A shepherd, unnoticed and uncelebrated, approached the moment not with weapons of war but with unwavering belief. What transpired in the Valley of Elah would ripple through generations, carried in whispered lessons and triumphant songs yet unborn. It would stand as a lasting testimony that the Lord does not measure by stature, armor, or reputation. Instead, he moves through willing hands, often choosing the overlooked to accomplish the unforgettable, and through them, history is forever altered. From the Philistine ranks emerged a figure unlike any other, Goliath of Gath. He moved with the weight of a mountain, each step a declaration that he belonged not to this valley, not to these people, but to history itself. His armor gleamed like a fortress built for war, a dark, unyielding shell that caught the first rays of the hesitant sun and turned them into blades of light. Every link of bronze, every glint of steel spoke of battles fought and victories claimed. He was more than a man. He was a shadow cast across the hearts of everyone who dared to look upon him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the Israelite lines as if they were nothing more than insects to be crushed beneath his heel. He laughed, a low rumbling sound that rolled across the valley like thunder before a storm. Every soldier felt it in his bones, a sound heavier than armor, heavier than shields, heavier than the fear that already gripped them. Then he spoke. His voice tore across the quiet of the valley like a lightning bolt. "Why do you come out to line up for battle, you Hebrews? Choose a man to come down and fight me. If he can defeat me, we will become your servants, but if I prevail, you will serve us." The words were not just loud, they were poison in the mind, tainting courage with dread. Soldiers pressed their hands against their hearts as if they could hold back the wave of fear. Even the strongest warriors faltered, glancing at one another as if to ask, who among us could stand against that? Goliath lifted his spear, taller than any man in the valley, its tip catching the light and throwing it across the Israelite lines like a warning. It was not merely a weapon, it was a statement. He was untouchable. The ground seemed to tremble under his presence. Horses shied, dust rose in small whirlwinds at his feet, and the banners of the Philistines fluttered as if even the wind itself recognized his dominion. He was a walking fortress, a living embodiment of the impossible, and yet beneath the weight of terror, something subtle began to stir in the hearts of a few. Among the Israelites, some soldiers remembered stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Some whispered of courage forged in faith, of hope that defied size and strength. But those whispers were almost drowned by the echo of Goliath's laughter. "Come down to me, send someone to fight. Who dares to challenge the champion of Gath?" Every word cut like a blade, every glance from his towering figure was a challenge, a test, a reminder that fear can paralyze as easily as a spear can pierce flesh. The Israelite ranks quaked. Some wanted to run, some wanted to hide, and some simply could not move at all, caught between the awe of human strength and the unseen weight of destiny pressing down upon them. High above, the cliffs seemed to shrink in his shadow. The valley itself, which had held its breath at sunrise, now trembled under his presence. The drums of war, though silent, seemed to beat in tandem with the pounding hearts of every soldier. And yet, just beyond the fear, a quiet flicker of possibility lingered, a thought that courage might not be measured by size, that faith could be stronger than steel, that destiny could choose the least likely to act. The shadow from Goth had arrived, the impossible challenge had been declared, and somewhere in the trembling silence, the stage was set for the extraordinary. Morning after morning, evening after evening, the giant repeated his challenge. 40 days of thunderous voice rolling across the Valley of Elah, mocking, taunting, crushing. Every insult sank like a stone into the hearts of the Israelites, cold and heavy, making courage slip through fingers like water. Soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, yet their hands shook. Spears hung uselessly, shields leaned against the earth, and even the most battle-hardened warriors felt a tremor of helplessness pulse through their veins. King Saul, robed in authority, sat high on the hill above the army, his crown heavy upon his brow. Not gold, but dread weighed him down. He stared at the giant, at the mountain of a man whose laughter seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the valley. Every plan he imagined dissolved under the shadow of impossibility. Every word he spoke to encourage his men felt hollow, swallowed by the relentless echo of the champion's voice. Fear had become a tangible thing, pressing down on armor, sinking into shields, seeping into hearts like an invisible poison. The valley itself seemed to answer the terror. Dawn hesitated before spilling its pale light. Birds stayed silent. Even the wind, which usually danced across the cliffs and stirred the tall grass, held its breath. Dust clung to the earth as if waiting for the inevitable strike. Each sunrise reminded the Israelites that the giant had not been met, that the impossible was still standing before them, unbroken, undefeated. Soldiers whispered to one another, glances darting toward their brothers for courage that could not be found. Fathers imagined their sons meeting the monstrous warrior. Mothers prayed silently with eyes pressed to the tents, their hands trembling in the morning chill. The smallest sound, a shield scraping the ground, a boot shifting in dust, echoed like a cannon in the valley, each movement magnified by the tension in the air. Fear had wrapped itself around them all like a living thing, suffocating and unrelenting, and yet beneath the shadow of despair, a faint flicker of possibility stirred. Not yet bravery, not yet action, but whispers of hope, almost drowned by the roar of terror. Some hearts remembered stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, of faith stronger than steel, of courage that measured itself not by stature but by obedience. These thoughts were fragile sparks, nearly extinguished but persistent, waiting for the moment they could ignite. By the 40th day, the valley had become a crucible of fear. The giant's presence had grown larger than life, each taunt sinking deeper, each laugh echoing longer. The soldiers were held hostage by dread, their spirits worn thin by repetition, by hopelessness, by the weight of the challenge they could not meet. And yet the whispers of hope persisted, subtle but undeniable, threading through the cracks of terror. 40 days of fear, 40 days of waiting, 40 days for the impossible to take root, for courage to rise in the unlikeliest heart, for destiny to choose a champion unseen, overlooked, untested. And somewhere in that trembling silence, the stage was set. The Valley of Elah was poised on the knife's edge between despair and deliverance. History waited. Far from the clamor of the battlefield, the hills rolled under a calm, golden sky. The air smelled of wild grass and earth warmed by the sun. In the midst of this quiet, a young shepherd moved among the sheep with a patience only someone who had spent countless hours alone could know. This was David, the youngest son of Jesse, boyish in stature but wide-eyed with a curiosity that seemed to capture the vastness of the world around him. David knew the language of the land, the way the wind shifted through the olive trees, how the river whispered secrets to the stones, how the stars burned faintly above, marking the hours of night like silent sentinels. Each step he took, he measured the ground carefully, mindful of his flock, humming softly as he walked, the melody of the fields rising from his lips like a prayer. That morning Jesse had given him bread and cheese, a small bundle of food wrapped in a cloth. "Take this to your brothers," his father said, voice edged with concern. "See how they fare. Bring back news and do not linger." David lifted the bundle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. To him it was more than bread and cheese. It was a message, a bridge from home to the chaos that had begun to spill across the valley below. His brothers were soldiers now, men hardened by fear and the grind of war. And here he was, just a boy, armed only with sling and staff, stepping toward a world that seemed impossibly large and frightening. As he walked, David's mind wandered. He thought of the valley his father had described, of the giant whose shadow loomed over the Israelite army. He thought of the whispers in the town, of trembling voices asking who would rise to meet the impossible. And yet he did not know fear in the same way others did. His heart, untested in battle, beat steady, guided by the rhythm of the land he had learned to read, the quiet courage of one who trusts not in his own strength, but in something larger, unseen. The sun climbed higher, painting the hills in hues of gold and amber. Sheep followed him obediently, bleating softly. David hummed again, not realizing the tune carried faint echoes of determination and resolve. Each step forward was simple, almost mundane, yet every step carried him closer to destiny. Every stone he passed, every ridge he climbed, seemed to whisper, "You are being prepared for something greater." Eventually, the faint sound of shouting reached his ears, carried by the wind from the valley below. He paused, glancing toward the distant plains where dust and banners swirled like restless spirits. Somewhere in that chaos were his brothers, and somewhere beyond that, a giant who had shaken the heart of Israel. David tightened his grip on the bundle and adjusted his sling over his shoulder. He did not yet know how he would face the shadow, but he was moving toward it, step by careful step, guided by the quiet confidence of one who walks in faith, not fear. And so the boy continued down the path, the shepherd on an errand, carrying bread, cheese, and the first stirrings of courage that would one day echo across the valley and into history. The hills were calm, the flock was safe, and in that moment of quiet before the storm, destiny waited. When David arrived at the Israelite camp, the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid tang of fear. Soldiers huddled behind their shields, eyes wide, faces pale. Their hands gripped weapons they barely dared to raise, and from the far side of the valley, Goliath's voice roared like thunder, bouncing off cliffs and carrying the weight of a world unchallenged. David froze, not from fear, but from awe. The giant's voice was more than sound. It was a declaration of defiance against God himself. Rage and wonder churned within the boy's heart, a strange mixture of indignation and curiosity. The words burned in his ears, echoing across the plain. "Choose a man to fight me. If he can stand against me, we will serve you. But if I prevail, you shall be our servants." David's hands tightened on the bundle of bread and cheese he still carried from home. His mind raced. How could any man, even a seasoned warrior, face this mountain of a Philistine? And yet a spark ignited inside him. His blood burned with a quiet fury at the sight of God's name mocked, of his people trembling, of his glory challenged. He stepped closer, moving past the tents, past the murmurs and the downcast faces of soldiers. He had heard stories, how his older brothers spoke with pride of valor, how they shook with fear when facing the impossible. But David could not stand by. Not when the armies of Israel, the people of God, were paralyzed by terror. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," he whispered, almost to himself, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The words left his lips like fire, a burning question that demanded action. He did not yet know how he would meet this giant. He did not know if his sling, his staff, or his faith would be enough. But a certainty settled in his chest. God had called him for such a time as this. And the words that burned in his heart would not fade. They would drive him forward, step by step, to a destiny that seemed impossible to the world around him. Around the camp, the murmurs grew. Some soldiers turned to watch the boy, small and untested, daring to speak what no man dared. Whispers of astonishment mixed with doubt, and even King Saul, looking down from his tent, noted the spark in this shepherd's eyes, a spark that might yet challenge the shadow of Goliath. The wind shifted, carrying the echo of the giant's laughter across the plain. David's jaw tightened. His heart was steady, his eyes locked on the distant figure of the Philistine, glimmered with resolve. The words had burned, and now the fire within him could not be extinguished. And so in the midst of fear, in the heart of doubt, a boy began to prepare, not with sword or shield, but with courage, faith, and the undeniable certainty that God's power would rise where human strength faltered. The sun hung low over the Israelite camp, casting long shadows that stretched across the tents like dark fingers. Soldiers murmured in nervous clusters, their faces pale with unease. Amid them David approached, carrying nothing but a simple satchel of provisions, his sling coiled at his side. His eyes swept over the battlefield ahead, where the Philistine giant loomed like a mountain in human form. As he neared his brothers, whispers rose like a rising wind. "Is that David?" someone asked. "The youngest son? Has he lost his mind?" Eliab, the eldest, turned sharply, his jaw tightening, and stepped forward. His gaze was fierce, a storm of anger and disbelief. "Why are you here, boy?" Eliab demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "What are you doing among men who carry swords and shields? Have you come to see your own death?" David lifted his chin, steady and calm. "I have not come for myself," he said, his voice clear, carrying a quiet authority that surprised some of the soldiers. "I have come because the Lord will deliver his people. He has delivered me before from lions and bears, and if he wills, he will deliver us again today." Eliab's eyes narrowed. "You speak like a man, but you are a boy. You think faith will save you from steel? You are too young, too small, too weak. Your words are empty against the giant who mocks Israel." David's heart beat steadily. He remembered the hills where he had watched over his father's sheep, facing predators far larger than himself. Each danger had been overcome not by sword but by trust. His courage had been forged there in solitude, in the quiet knowledge that God's hand could reach further than his own. He stepped closer, meeting Eliab's gaze without flinching. "Do not mistake my youth for weakness, brother. The battle belongs to the Lord. Today I go not for honor, not for glory, but for his name. If he is with me, no giant can stand in his way." Some soldiers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or to tremble at his boldness. A few even nodded in quiet admiration. Eliab, however, could not see faith. He saw only risk, only folly. Faith will not save you from the sword. "Stand aside, David, before your foolishness brings shame upon us all." David swallowed, feeling the sting of his brother's words. But he did not retreat. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting a deep calm settle over him. He thought of his family's fields, the rushing streams, the stillness of the night sky, and the countless hours spent protecting his flock. Each memory was a testament to God's providence. He whispered a prayer, not for victory alone, but for courage, clarity, and the strength to stand when the world sought to shake him. He opened his eyes, unwavering. "It is not for me to fight alone. It is the Lord who fights with us. Today he will show that the strength of man is nothing without his guidance." Eliab threw up his hands in frustration and stormed away, muttering bitterly under his breath. David watched him go, understanding that ridicule often comes from fear of the unseen, of what cannot be measured by size or strength. Around him soldiers murmured again, some with skepticism, some with cautious hope. David adjusted the sling over his shoulder, picked up 5 smooth stones from the dry ground, and took a slow, steadying breath. The valley below awaited, and the giant's shadow stretched long across the land. He knew that ridicule and doubt would not stop him. Faith would, and with that faith he stepped forward, leaving behind the sting of scorn and carrying only trust and courage into the face of impossibility. Not everyone welcomed David's words. As his voice carried through the camp, clear, steady, unafraid, a sudden presence cut through the murmurs. A shadow fell across him, tall and armored, blocking the sun. David turned and saw a familiar face, hardened by years of expectation and disappointment. Eliab, his eldest brother, the firstborn, the warrior, the one who had stood tall when Samuel came searching for a king, the one everyone expected God to choose. Eliab's eyes burned as he looked down at David, not with pride, not with concern, but with scorn. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. The camp grew quiet. Soldiers nearby slowed their movements, sensing something sharper than fear unfolding. Eliab's voice carried the weight of authority, of age, of rank, of long-held resentment. "Why did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness?" he continued. "I know your heart. I know your pride. You came down here just to watch the battle." Each word landed like a blow. This was not Goliath's roar. This was worse. This was blood. This was the voice David had known since childhood. The brother who had watched him grow small in the shadow of stronger men. The brother who had gone to war while David stayed behind, forgotten among sheep and silence. Around them, soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement. Others avoided looking at David altogether. In their eyes, Eliab was right. A shepherd did not belong among warriors. A boy did not speak of faith where trained men trembled. David felt the weight of every gaze. He could feel the familiar sting, the same one he had felt when he was overlooked, dismissed, sent back to the fields. The same feeling of being unseen, unvalued, out of place. For a moment, memories threatened to rise. Cold nights alone with sheep, mockery from brothers who thought his songs foolish, the quiet knowledge that he was always the last choice. Eliab's words echoed louder in his mind than the giant's taunts. "You don't belong here. You're just a boy. You came for yourself." David could have defended himself. He could have reminded Eliab of the lions and bears he had faced alone, of the nights he risked his life while no one watched, of the faith forged far from applause and approval. He could have raised his voice. He could have fought back, but he didn't. David took a breath, and in that breath was something rare, control. Not weakness, control. He looked up at his brother, not with anger, not with shame, but with calm clarity. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but it carried. "What have I done now?" David asked. Not sarcasm, not defiance, just honesty. Then he added words that would echo far beyond the camp. "Is there not a cause?" The question hung in the air. David wasn't asking permission. He wasn't seeking approval. He was pointing to something larger than pride, larger than family tension, larger than fear. There was a cause. God's name was being mocked. God's people were trembling. God's promises were being questioned. And silence to David was no longer an option. Eliab scoffed, shaking his head. To him, David was still the same, too small, too idealistic, too unaware of the real world. He turned away, dismissing him as insignificant. But David did not follow. He did not argue. He did not chase validation. He did not try to prove himself. Instead, he turned toward the camp, toward the soldiers, toward the valley, toward the giant's voice that still echoed in the distance. The rejection of blood did not shake him. It clarified him. David had learned something in the fields that could not be taught in tents or ranks or armor. He had learned that calling does not come with consensus, that obedience often walks alone, and that sometimes the sharpest resistance comes not from enemies, but from those closest to you. The camp buzzed again with whispers. "Who is that boy? Did you hear what he said? He's not afraid." David kept moving. Each step carried him farther from Eliab's doubt and closer to something unavoidable. He did not know how the story would end. He did not yet see the stone or the sling or the victory. But his heart was steady. He had not come seeking glory. He had not come to prove himself. He had come bearing faith. And that faith, though ridiculed, would not be silenced. Word spread quickly through the camp. At first it was only whispers. Quiet murmurs passed between soldiers who had grown used to fear and silence. A boy had spoken boldly. A shepherd, one who was not shaken by the giant's voice. One who spoke of God as if he were not distant, not silent but present. The whispers reached the commanders reached the guards, and finally the words reached the king. "Bring him to me," Saul said. Inside the king's tent, the air was heavy. Maps lay scattered across tables. Armor leaned against wooden posts. Saul sat alone, the weight of leadership etched into his face. Once chosen by God, once filled with promise, he now carried the burden of a nation trembling before a single man. Then the guards parted the tent flap, and David stepped inside. He did not look like a warrior. No armor, no sword, no scars from battle. Just a shepherd's clothes, dust from the road still clinging to his sandals, a sling hanging quietly at his side. Yet his eyes were clear, steady, unafraid. Saul studied him in silence. This was the one they spoke of. This was the voice stirring courage in the camp. "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him," Saul finally said. His voice was not cruel, only tired. "You are but a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth." The words were heavy with reality. Saul was not mocking David, he was protecting him. A king who had already lost too much did not wish to lose a boy as well. But David did not shrink. He stepped forward, respectful but resolute. His voice did not rise, it did not tremble. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father," he began. Saul listened, expecting innocence. Instead, he heard something else, experience. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, David continued, "I went after it. I struck it and rescued the lamb from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it." The tent fell silent. David was not boasting. He was remembering, night after night alone in the fields. No audience, no applause, only danger and God. "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear," he said. "This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." Saul's eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but in recognition. David's confidence was not in his hands, not in his sling, not in his courage. It was elsewhere. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," David said, his voice firm now, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." That was the difference. David did not speak of strength. He spoke of trust. He did not claim fearlessness. He claimed faith. Saul leaned back slowly. In David's words, he heard something he had not felt in a long time, the sound of reliance on God, rather than strategy, the sound of obedience, rather than calculation, the sound of a heart that believed God was still active, still powerful, still faithful. For a moment Saul saw himself as he once was, chosen, anointed, unafraid. Silence stretched between them. Then Saul nodded. "Go," he said quietly, "and may the Lord be with you." It was not a command of confidence. It was a surrender of hope. Saul rose and placed his armor upon David, his helmet, his coat of mail, the weight of a king's battles pressing down on a shepherd's shoulders. David tried to walk, but the armor dragged him back. It was too heavy, too unfamiliar. "I cannot go in these," David said gently. "I am not used to them," and so he took them off. What stood before Saul was not a warrior shaped by war, but a servant shaped by trust. David turned to leave the tent, sling at his side, faith steady in his heart. Behind him stood a king who had everything, rank, armor, authority, yet lacked the one thing the shepherd carried effortlessly, trust in the living God. And as David stepped back into the light, toward the valley and the giant's voice, something shifted. The battle was no longer about strength versus strength. It was about faith versus fear, and the shepherd had already chosen his side. Saul watched the boy with a mixture of hope and desperation. His heart still carried the weight of doubt. How could this youth, small and untested, stand against the giant who had terrorized Israel for 40 days? "Take my armor," Saul said, lifting the breastplate, the helmet, the greaves polished to a gleaming shine. "Wear my sword, wear my shield, go now and face him." David looked at the gleaming armor. It glinted in the morning sun like a promise, but it was not a promise he could keep. He lifted the helmet, it slid over his head and slipped down over his eyes. He tried to move, but every step felt clumsy. The breastplate weighed his chest like a mountain. The greaves dug into his legs. The sword was heavy in his hand, alien and unwieldy. He stopped, heart steady, mind clear. Every fiber of his being told him that this was not the way. Saul's weapons had served a king, a warrior, a man forged in war. But David was not that man. David was a shepherd, a boy, one who knew the land, the stones, the rhythm of the wind, the sharpness of a sling, the weight of a staff in hand. He shook his head gently. "I cannot go in this," David said quietly. His voice carried the calm of certainty. "I am not trained in these things. This armor is not mine." Saul looked at him, disbelief mixed with fear. "But how will you face him?" the king asked. "Without my protection, without my weapons." David did not answer immediately. He knelt and touched the ground, feeling the earth beneath him, as if seeking counsel from the very land that had shaped him. He remembered the fields, the sheep, The quiet nights, the way he had faced lions and bears alone, the way he had survived not by strength but by faith. Then he rose, eyes clear, jaw set. He would go as he was, unburdened, unencumbered, guided by what he knew to be true, not by what others insisted he wear, not by what seemed necessary to human eyes. He reached down and picked up his sling, worn smooth from use. He gripped his staff, the weight familiar and steady in his hands, and then he turned toward the brook nearby, bending low to choose 5 smooth stones, each one perfect in its shape and weight. 5 simple stones, carried with care in the pouch at his side. 5 stones, unremarkable to any other eye, but each one chosen with intention, with faith, with experience. He stood there, small against the morning light, unarmored, carrying no sword, no shield, no breastplate of bronze, and yet in that moment he was larger than any man in the camp, not because of stature, not because of pride, not because of skill, but because of certainty. Saul watched, his heart torn between disbelief and hope. The king's armor had failed him, his warriors had faltered, but this boy, this shepherd, had found a way to stand, not with human weapons, but with the tools given by God. David tightened his grip on the sling. He shifted the stones in his pouch, feeling their weight, their potential. Each one was a reminder of preparation, of patience, of unseen power. Each one was a promise that courage could exist, even where fear ruled, that faith could make the smallest hand mightier than the largest sword. And so, with the armor of a king set aside, with the weapons of a shepherd and stones in hand, David stepped out toward the valley. He did not run, he did not boast. He walked steadily, quietly, with the rhythm of one who trusted the unseen. The army watched him go, unsure what to hope for, unsure whether this small figure could stand where the giant loomed like a mountain. But David did not falter. He did not doubt. He did not wait for permission or validation. He walked toward the impossible, carrying only what he knew, what he trusted, and what God had already prepared in his hand. In that moment, the armor that did not fit became a lesson for all who watched. Courage is not found in bronze and steel, but in the unshakable heart that moves where faith leads, even when fear surrounds you. David's steps echoed across the valley. The battle had not yet begun. The giant had not yet seen him, and yet destiny was already in motion. The morning sun stretched pale fingers across the Valley of Elah. Dust swirled in lazy eddies over the dry earth, catching the light and turning the valley floor into a sea of gold and shadow. And there, standing at the far end, Goliath loomed like a moving mountain, his bronze armor shining with every step, every motion exaggerated by the enormity of his size. David descended from the hill where the Israelite army waited. His feet moved carefully, yet steadily, across the rocky path. Each step seemed to echo in the still air, amplified by the hushed expectation of soldiers who dared not speak. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath, remembering the 40 days of fear, remembering the giant's roar, remembering the way courage had faltered under the weight of dread. He gripped the sling at his side. His pouch of 5 smooth stones swayed lightly against his leg, each one chosen carefully from the brook. Each one carried a memory. The roar of the lion, the swipe of the bear, the quiet nights of guarding sheep, the trust in a God who had always been faithful. From the far side, Goliath's laughter thundered across the valley, sharp and cruel. It carried with it mockery, defiance, and the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He bellowed insults, cursing David by the gods of his people, shaking the air with the sound of a voice unchallenged. Soldiers on both sides froze. Shields wavered, spears lowered slightly under the weight of dread, and yet David did not falter. The sound rolled over him, but it could not reach the courage within him. For him, the voice of the giant was only noise, louder than usual. Yes, but meaningless in the presence of purpose. He remembered his words before Saul. Not strength, not skill, not human power, only trust, only faith. He tightened his grip on the sling and felt the comfort of the staff in his hand. He adjusted the pouch of stones. The smallest of these might be the one that would bring life to his people and silence the mocking of the enemy. Goliath roared again, stepping forward, raising his spear high, his shadow stretching across the valley like a dark wave. He pointed at David. "Come here, boy," he shouted. "I will feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Somewhere behind him, David heard whispers from the Israelite army. Fear, maybe even despair. But he did not turn. He did not glance at Saul's tent. He did not pause. He only moved forward, step by step toward the impossible. As he walked, he scanned the valley. The cliffs loomed above. Dust swirled at his feet. The wind whispered, carrying the faint echoes of the people he loved, the flock he had tended, and the God who had guided him through every trial. Every step became a prayer, every heartbeat a testament that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The laughter of Goliath grew louder, more taunting, more brazen. He gestured, swung his spear, and cursed again. Yet David's eyes never left the giants, not with hatred, not with arrogance, not with anger, only with focus, only with faith. The valley seemed suspended in time. Every soldier held their breath. The wind paused. Even the birds vanished from the cliffs, as if nature itself waited. The impossible was about to happen. A boy, unarmored, carrying only a sling and 5 stones, was stepping into history. Step by step, David approached. With each movement, the shadow of fear began to shrink, not because it vanished, but because something greater had taken root in the heart of the smallest man on the field. A courage that no amount of taunting could erode, a trust that no spear could pierce. And in the silence between roars, the pause before the storm, the valley seemed to whisper, "Destiny is here." The giant's laughter faded into a low, rumbling echo as David finally stopped walking. He stood now in the open heart of the valley alone, exposed, unarmored. Dust clung to his sandals, the sling hung loose at his side. Before him Goliath loomed, towering and terrible, bronze armor glinting beneath the rising sun like a living fortress. For a moment, silence settled between them. Then David spoke. His voice did not rise in anger, it did not shake with fear. It carried not the volume of a warrior, but the weight of conviction. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David said, his words rolling across the valley, clear and steady. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The soldiers on the hills leaned forward, some gasped, others closed their eyes. No one had ever spoken to Goliath like this before. The giant sneered, his grip tightening on his spear. But David continued, his voice growing stronger, firmer, as though each word anchored him deeper into something unseen. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands," he declared, "and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, so that the whole world will know there is a God in Israel." The valley seemed to tremble, not with fear, but with the force of the proclamation. David was no longer just speaking to a giant. He was speaking to history, to nations, to generations yet unborn. "All those gathered here will know," he continued, lifting his chin, his eyes unwavering, "that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." For a heartbeat, no one moved, not Saul, not the soldiers, not even Goliath. The wind swept through the valley, tugging at cloaks and banners, carrying David's words far beyond the battlefield. Something shifted in the air, subtle, invisible, yet undeniable. Fear that had ruled for 40 days began to loosen its grip. David felt it within himself. He was no longer the shepherd sent on an errand, no longer the boy dismissed by his brothers, no longer the unarmored figure mocked by a giant. He was standing exactly where he was meant to stand. Behind him, the Israelite army stirred, hands tightened, not in fear this time, but in awe. A few soldiers straightened their backs, others felt something long buried begin to rise, hope. Across the valley, Goliath's expression darkened. This was not the reaction he expected. He had faced kings, warriors, and champions. He had seen men break before ever lifting a weapon. But this boy, this shepherd, did not shrink, did not plead, did not boast of his own strength. He spoke of God, and that unsettled the giant more than any blade ever had. David's heart pounded, not with panic, but with purpose. Every word he had spoken echoed inside him, reinforcing what he had always known in the quiet hills with his sheep. God was faithful, God was powerful, and God did not require size, armor, or reputation to accomplish his will. The declaration had been made. The challenge was no longer about David versus Goliath. It was no longer about Israel versus the Philistines. It was about whether human might could stand against divine authority. The valley waited, the armies watched, and in the space between faith and action, between declaration and deliverance, history held its breath, knowing that what came next would echo far beyond this day. The final words of David's declaration had barely faded when he moved. Not backward, not sideways, forward. Without hesitation, David broke into a run. Dust exploded beneath his feet as he sprinted down the valley floor, the dry earth cracking under the sudden urgency of his steps. The sound was sharp, startling, like the first strike of thunder before a storm. Every instinct of survival screamed that this was madness. No armor, no shield, no sword, only a sling, a staff, and faith. The armies watched in disbelief. From the hills of Israel, mouths fell open. Soldiers leaned forward, some gripping their spears so tightly their knuckles turned white. For 40 days they had stood frozen, rooted in fear. And now a boy was running toward the thing they dared not face. Across the valley, the Philistines erupted in laughter. They saw recklessness. They saw foolish courage. They saw a child sprinting toward death. But David felt something else entirely. The wind rushed past his ears as he ran, carrying the scent of dust and sweat and sun-baked stone. His heart pounded, not with panic but with purpose. Each step echoed with memory. Nights beneath the stars, the weight of a lamb across his shoulders, the sudden roar of a lion from the dark. He had run then too, not away but toward danger. Faith had taught his feet where to go long before this day. Goliath reacted late. The giant's laughter twisted into confusion, then into fury. He shifted his weight, raising his spear, his massive armor clanking with the sound of grinding metal. The ground trembled as he stepped forward, shadows stretching long and dark across the valley floor. But David did not slow. Dust clouded around him, clinging to his tunic, stinging his eyes. He reached into his pouch mid-stride, fingers finding the smooth curve of stone. Not rushed, not frantic, calm, intentional. The stone fit perfectly in his palm, familiar as a heartbeat. Behind him, silence fell over the Israelite army. No cheers, no cries, just stunned stillness. This was not how battles were supposed to begin. David closed the distance quickly now. The giant loomed larger with every stride, his armor blazing under the sun. Each step felt like crossing a line. Fear behind him, faith beneath him, destiny rushing to meet him head-on. The sling came alive in David's hand. As he ran, he began to whirl it, the leather straps humming through the air, building speed, building force. The motion was fluid, practiced, as natural as breathing. This was not improvisation. This was preparation revealed. The armies barely breathed. Time seemed to stretch, to slow, as if the valley itself leaned in to watch. Dust hung suspended in golden light. The sound of the sling cut through the air, sharp and focused. The giant lifted his shield too late, confidence collapsing into urgency. David's feet planted. One final step. One final motion. He released the stone. It flew fast, true, unstoppable, cutting through the space between faith and fear. In that instant, everything converged. 40 days of taunts, years of unseen obedience, a declaration spoken in trust, and a run fueled by belief. The stone was already on its way, and the world was about to change. David's fingers slipped into the pouch at his side. The world seemed to narrow, to quiet, to focus on that single motion. Inside the leather sat 5 smooth stones, rounded by years of water and time. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind no one would ever notice. David did not hesitate. His hand closed around one. Cool, solid, familiar. He placed the stone into the sling. The leather cradled it perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment since the day it was shaped by the stream. David's grip tightened, his breathing slowed. The noise of the valley faded into something distant and dull, like thunder heard from far away. Across the battlefield, Goliath advanced. Each step of the giant shook the ground, armor clashing, spear gleaming, his face twisted with rage now, confidence cracking into fury. He raised his shield, towering, massive, certain that no thrown stone could threaten him. David began to spin the sling. Once, twice, the straps cut through the air with a sharp rising hum. The sound grew louder, faster, tighter, focused. The motion was smooth, practiced, precise. This was not guesswork. This was muscle memory born of long, lonely nights guarding sheep, of countless small stones sent flying at predators that lurked in the dark. The armies watched, frozen. Some could not look away, others covered their mouths in disbelief. A few whispered prayers they had not spoken in years. Time slowed. Dust hung motionless in the air. The sunlight caught the spinning sling, flashing briefly like fire. Goliath lifted his spear, preparing to strike, but the distance was closing too fast. His shield shifted too late. David's eyes locked onto the giant's forehead, not with hatred, not with fear, with trust. In that instant, David was not thinking of victory or survival. He was thinking of obedience, of the God who had delivered him before, of the truth he had spoken moments earlier, that the battle belonged to the Lord. He released. The stone left the sling with a sharp crack, tearing through the air like a bolt of judgment. Faster than thought, faster than reaction, it cut across the valley in a heartbeat, invisible to most eyes, unstoppable once set free. The sound was sudden, a dull, thunderous impact. The stone struck Goliath square in the forehead. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the giant staggered. His roar died in his throat. The spear slipped from his hand. His knees buckled, armor shifting wildly as balance abandoned him. Shock flashed across his face. Not pain, not rage, but disbelief. The unthinkable had happened. The mountain was falling. Goliath crashed to the ground face first, the earth shuddering beneath his weight. Dust erupted around his body, rolling outward like a wave. The sound echoed off the valley walls, a final terrible punctuation to 40 days of fear. Silence followed, absolute. The Philistine army stared, frozen, unable to process what their eyes had witnessed. The Israelite soldiers stood motionless, breath caught in their chests, minds struggling to catch up with reality. A stone, just one, no sword, no spear, no armor, only faith, released at the right moment. David stood still, sling hanging loose at his side. He did not cheer, he did not raise his arms. He simply watched as the dust settled around the fallen giant, knowing deep in his bones that this was never about him. The impossible had become undeniable. God had spoken, and the world would never forget the power of a single stone placed in faithful hands. The stone struck, not with chance, not with luck, with terrifying precision. It slammed into Goliath's forehead, the only place his armor did not cover, a small opening no human strategist would have dared to aim for in the chaos of battle. The sound was sharp and final, a cracking impact that echoed louder than any shout the giant had ever made. For a breathless moment the world froze. Goliath's roar was cut short, strangled in his chest. His eyes widened, not in pain but in shock. The invincible champion of Gath, the terror of Israel, the mountain of bronze and flesh, swayed where he stood. His spear slipped from his grasp. The massive shield tilted, then crashed to the ground with a metallic thunder that rolled across the valley. The giant's knees buckled, bending under a weight they had never known before, not the weight of armor, but the weight of defeat. The earth itself seemed to recoil. Time slowed as Goliath pitched forward. His enormous body fell face down into the dust, the impact sending a tremor through the valley floor. Stones rattled. Dust erupted in a thick, choking cloud that swallowed his fallen form. The sound of his collapse echoed against the cliffs, deep, hollow, final, and then silence. No cheers, no cries, no movement. The Philistine army stood frozen, eyes locked on the body of the champion who had never fallen. Mouths hung open, weapons slipped from hands. The impossible had happened so quickly their minds could not keep up. On the hills opposite, the Israelites stared in disbelief. Some blinked, convinced their eyes had betrayed them. Others clutched their chests, hearts pounding as reality crashed in. The giant was down. 40 days of fear lay broken in the dust. David stood still. The sling dangled loosely from his hand, its work finished. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. His eyes never left the fallen form before him. He knew this moment was sacred. This was not triumph born of skill. This was not victory earned by strength. This was deliverance. The dust slowly settled, revealing Goliath's massive body sprawled motionless on the valley floor. The sun glinted off his helmet, now useless. His armor, once terrifying, looked like an abandoned shell. The champion of the Philistines lay face down before a shepherd. A ripple passed through both armies. Fear, once Israel's master, shifted sides. The Philistines felt it first. A cold realization crept through their ranks. If their strongest had fallen, what hope remained? Whispers spread. Eyes darted. Confidence drained away like water through cracked stone. Among the Israelites, something long buried awakened. Courage. Not loud yet, not reckless, but real. David took a step forward. The valley, moments ago paralyzed, leaned toward its next breath. Everyone sensed it. This was not the end of the moment, but the turning of the tide. The strike had not only silenced a giant, it had shattered an illusion. That human power is ultimate, that fear is undefeatable, that God is distant. The fallen giant testified otherwise. Goliath had mocked the living God. He had trusted armor, size, reputation, and terror. And now he lay defeated, not by an army, not by a king, but by a boy who believed. The earth was still, the dust was settling, and history had just been rewritten by the sound of a single stone finding its mark. For a single heartbeat, the valley was silent. Not the calm silence of peace, but the stunned stillness that follows the impossible. Dust drifted slowly through the air, glowing in the sunlight. Goliath's body lay unmoving, face down in the earth, armor scattered, the terror of 40 days reduced to silence. No one spoke, no one moved. The army stood frozen, suspended between disbelief and awakening. It was as if time itself had paused, giving the world a moment to absorb what had just occurred. Then realization began to spread. It moved quietly at first, like a spark catching dry grass. A soldier on the Israelite hillside leaned forward, squinting through the settling dust. Another lowered his shield, heart pounding. Whispers rippled through the ranks, tentative and breathless. Is he down? Did he fall? Is this real? Across the valley, the Philistines felt it too. Their champion was not rising. Seconds stretched into eternity. Goliath did not move. His spear remained where it had fallen. The shield lay useless at his side. The truth crept in slowly, unwilling to be believed. Fear changed hands. On the Israelite side, something ancient stirred, something long forgotten during the long days of dread. Shoulders straightened, hands tightened around weapons, not in terror now, but readiness. Eyes that had avoided the valley for weeks now locked onto it with growing fire. Faith was waking up. David stood alone in the center of the valley, small against the vastness of the battlefield, yet unshaken. The sling hung still at his side. His chest rose and fell calmly, as though he had just completed an ordinary task. But all eyes were on him, a shepherd, standing where a giant had ruled. The Philistines felt the shift more sharply. Murmurs turned into uneasy movement. A few men stepped backward without realizing it. Others glanced at their leaders, searching for commands that did not come. Their confidence was gone. The illusion of invincibility had shattered. Then it happened. A single shout rose from the Israelite ranks, raw, disbelieving, full of release. It was followed by another, then another. The silence broke. The shout became a roar, rolling down the hills like thunder, crashing through the valley with unstoppable force. Shields slammed together, swords were raised. Men cried out, not in fear but in victory. The Philistines recoiled. The sound hit them like a wave. Panic flared in their eyes. Their formation wavered, cracked, began to splinter. The realization they had tried to outrun now overtook them fully. The giant was dead. The shepherd had won, and the God of Israel had answered. The valley that had held its breath for 40 days finally exhaled. What followed would be chaos, pursuit, clash, and flight. But this moment, this sacred pause between miracle and movement, would live forever. The instant when silence testified louder than any shout, when fear collapsed, when faith roared to life, and when history turned, not with the clash of steel, but with the realization that God had moved among men. The roar of Israel still thundered across the valley when David moved again. He did not linger in the cheers. He did not look back at the hills. His eyes were fixed on the fallen giant. David ran toward Goliath's motionless body, dust kicking up beneath his feet. The Philistine champion lay face down, silent now, the power that had once filled his voice completely gone. His armor, moments ago a symbol of terror, lay heavy and useless against the earth. The shepherd slowed as he approached. For a brief moment, he stood over the giant, small beside the massive form, boy beside legend, faith beside fear made flesh. The contrast was unmistakable. This was the place where dread had ruled for 40 days. This was the ground where courage had withered, and now it was the ground of victory. David reached for the giant's sword. It was enormous, far heavier than anything he had ever carried. The hilt was thick, the blade long and battle-worn, forged for hands that trusted in strength alone. David gripped it with both hands, feeling the weight of it pull against his arms. This sword had taken lives. This sword had enforced fear. This sword had upheld a lie, that power belongs to the biggest, the strongest, the most feared. David lifted it. The movement drew every eye in the valley. The Philistines gasped. The Israelites fell silent again, this time not in disbelief but in awe. With a decisive motion, David struck. The act was swift, final, unmistakable. The champion of the Philistines was defeated by his own weapon. The sword of the enemy had become the instrument of victory. David stepped back, breathing steady, the work complete. He stood there for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over the valley like a tangible presence. Fear, once so loud, was gone. Its voice had been silenced completely. Then the valley erupted. The Israelites surged forward with a shout that shook the hills, their courage unleashed at last. What had been locked inside them for weeks burst free in a flood of movement and sound. Shields lifted, swords flashed, feet thundered as the army poured into the valley, chasing the fleeing Philistines. The enemy broke ranks. What had begun with mocking laughter now ended in panic. The Philistines turned and ran, abandoning weapons, formation and pride. The presence that had held them confident, their champion, their terror was gone. And David stood still. He did not chase, he did not boast, he did not raise the sword in celebration. He simply stood where fear once ruled. The sun climbed higher now, casting clear light over the valley. The dust settled. The fallen giant lay defeated, no longer a threat, no longer a shadow over God's people. David looked down at the sword in his hands, the weapon that was never meant for him, now forever tied to his story. He understood something deeper than triumph. Victory did not come from adopting the enemy's strength. It came from trusting God and letting God turn the enemy's power against itself. The battle belonged to the Lord, and the evidence lay before them all. That day Israel would remember more than a fallen giant. They would remember the moment fear lost its throne, the moment a shepherd stood where terror had ruled, the moment God proved before armies, before nations, before history, that he saves not by sword or spear. And yet the sword mattered, not because it was powerful, but because it was surrendered. The enemy's greatest weapon had become a testimony. Victory stood in the valley, and fear would never reign there again. The moment fear lost its champion, it lost its grip. Across the Philistine ranks, panic ignited like fire in dry brush. What had once been a disciplined army began to fracture. Eyes darted from the fallen giant to one another, searching for reassurance that no longer existed. Orders went unheard, formation dissolved, confidence drained away in an instant. The Philistines turned and ran. Shields were dropped, spears clattered against stone. Men who had mocked moments earlier now fled without looking back, their footsteps pounding the earth in frantic retreat. The valley that had echoed with arrogance now echoed with chaos. On the opposite hills Israel erupted. A roar surged from the Israelite army, not the roar of rage, but the roar of release. 40 days of fear broke loose in a single cry. Men who had stood frozen now surged forward, legs moving almost before their minds could catch up. Strength flooded back into weary bodies. Courage, long buried, rushed to the surface. They charged into the valley. Dust billowed beneath thousands of feet as Israel poured forward, chasing their enemies beyond the place of dread. Swords flashed in the sunlight. Voices shouted, not in panic but in unity. The valley that had once held them captive now became the ground of pursuit. Fear had changed direction. The Philistines fled toward the roads that led back to their cities, stumbling over one another in desperation. The power they had trusted was gone, and with it their will to stand. What remained was only survival. Israel pressed on. Men who had doubted themselves now ran with purpose. Old warriors felt strength return to their limbs. Young soldiers discovered courage they did not know they possessed. The impossible victory at the center of the valley had rewritten what they believed about themselves and about God. This was not just a chase, it was a reversal. The ground that once bore the weight of dread now thundered with hope. Each step Israel took away from the valley carried them further from fear and closer to freedom. The enemy that had stood unchallenged now scattered before them, stripped of authority. Behind them, the Valley of Elah stood quiet again. The place of terror had become a testimony. The fallen giant lay far behind, already fading into history, while the living moved forward, restored, renewed, alive with purpose. The valley no longer defined Israel's weakness. It marked the moment their faith rose. The pursuit continued until the Philistines were driven beyond the borders, beyond the shadows they once cast. And when the chase finally slowed, Israel stood victorious, not because they were stronger, but because they had remembered who fought for them. The battle had not begun with a charge, it began with trust, and now as the dust settled and the sun climbed high, Israel stood changed. The fear that once ruled them had fled with the enemy. In its place stood confidence, not in weapons, not in numbers, but in the God who had delivered them. The valley was behind them. The victory was before them, and the story of a shepherd had become the story of a nation restored. The battle ended, but the story did not. As the dust of the valley settled and the sun dipped lower in the sky, something new began to stir across the land of Israel. It did not arrive with the clash of weapons or the thunder of marching feet. It came softly, on voices, on memory, on song. Women stepped out from towns and villages along the roads. They came with tambourines and lyres, with laughter and tears, with hearts overflowing from the weight that had been lifted. Their voices rose together, not rehearsed, not polished, but alive with joy. They sang of deliverance. They sang of the day fear fell. They sang of a shepherd who trusted God. The melodies traveled farther than the sound of battle ever could. From hill to hill, from home to home, the story spread, not as a tale of bloodshed, but of hope restored. Children listened wide-eyed. Elders nodded quietly, recognizing the hand of God in what had happened. David heard the songs as he walked among the people. His name was woven into their words, carried on music that danced through the air. Yet he did not lift his head in pride. He did not slow his steps to draw attention. His heart remained steady, anchored to the truth he had always known. This was never about him. The women sang, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. But even as the words echoed, David understood the deeper meaning behind them. The numbers were not the message. The miracle was, God had acted. David's name spread throughout the land, not as a conqueror of men, not as a warrior seeking glory, but as a servant of God who had trusted when no one else would. Mothers spoke his name softly to their children, not as a legend to fear, but as an example to follow. He believed, they said. He obeyed. He trusted God. In the quiet moments between songs, David reflected. He remembered the fields, the sheep, the long nights beneath the stars. He remembered being overlooked, sent away, forgotten by those who should have seen him. And now, without seeking it, he was known, not because he demanded attention, but because obedience had a voice of its own. The songs continued. They followed the army back to the cities. They filled courtyards and doorways. They lingered long after the day had passed, settling into the soul of the nation. Victory was no longer just a moment. It had become memory. Yet with recognition came something else, expectation. Eyes turned toward David now. Whispers followed him. People wondered what God might do next through the shepherd who faced a giant without fear. The path ahead would not be simple. Praise has a way of opening doors and creating trials, but for now the songs were pure. They honored God's faithfulness. They celebrated courage, rooted in trust. They reminded Israel of who they were and whose they were. As night fell and the music softened, David looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over him in the fields. He felt no need to grasp the moment. He let it pass through him like a gentle wind. The songs would fade with time, but the truth they carried would endure. That God lifts the humble, that faith can change a nation, that obedience, even unseen, can echo across generations. And so the songs rose, not to crown a hero, but to remember a God who saves. The battle was over. The dust had settled. The valley that had held its breath for 40 days now lay quiet, bathed in the late afternoon sun. Victory belonged to Israel, yet the victory belonged to more than the army. It belonged to a boy, a shepherd, a servant of God, David. King Saul stood alone on a rise, looking out over the battlefield. His eyes traced the movements of the young man who had felled Goliath and turned fear into hope. David moved among the soldiers, helping the wounded, calming the shaken, speaking quietly but firmly. Every step he took radiated a quiet authority that Saul could not command, a confidence not born of crowns or armies, but of trust in something greater than himself. Saul's chest tightened as he watched, awe mixed with unease. The king had faced enemies before. He had commanded soldiers, wielded armies, even vanquished foes in battle himself. Yet here was a shepherd boy who had done what seasoned warriors had only feared to attempt. He had acted with courage Saul had not expected, and in doing so, he had altered the course of Israel's future. The soldiers whispered David's name, and those whispers spread like wildfire. Mothers told their children of the shepherd who trusted God. Merchants repeated the story in the marketplaces. Villagers sang it at evening fires. Everywhere, David's name carried with it hope, admiration, and something else Saul could not ignore, expectation. Saul's eyes narrowed as he followed the boy. He thought back over the past weeks, 40 days of fear, a giant's taunts, a city paralyzed by dread. He remembered the soldiers who had stood frozen, the elders who had sighed in despair, and the people who had prayed in silence. David had stood where all others trembled, and the impossible had been made real. The king felt the weight of what had happened. The victory was Israel's, yes, but it had been accomplished without Saul's command, without his plan, without his sword. David had shown what the king had long suspected, but had never fully realized, that strength alone does not win battles, and fear does not protect a throne. Obedience, courage, and trust could do what armies could not. Saul's mind wandered to the crown he wore. His lineage, his authority, his power, all seemed suddenly fragile. The people's hearts were no longer bound to him in awe or fear. Their eyes now followed David. Their voices echoed his name. The king realized, with a pang, that history had shifted. This was not mere battlefield strategy. This was transformation. A shepherd boy had become a symbol, a living testimony that God moves through the faithful, the overlooked, the humble. Saul stepped down from his hill and walked through the camp. Soldiers parted silently as he passed, and wherever he looked, he saw David surrounded by admiration and trust, yet entirely unaware of the sway he held. The king's awe deepened, but unease festered in its shadow. Change had come to Israel, and it had arrived in the form of a boy Saul could neither control nor command. He thought of what this meant for the days ahead. David would rise in fame, the people would sing his praises, and Saul, though still king, understood that the kingdom itself, its hearts, its faith, its destiny, had begun to follow someone else. One shepherd, one act of faith, had altered the path of a nation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the hills gold and crimson, Saul looked over Israel. The army celebrated, the people rejoiced, and David moved quietly among them, neither boastful nor proud. The king's awe deepened, the unease lingered, and the truth became undeniable. The shepherd had changed everything, and Israel would never be the same again. The Valley of Elah lay quiet once more. Dust settled on the earth, soft and golden in the afternoon sun. The echoes of battle had faded, yet the story had only begun. The fall of Goliath was no longer just an event of swords and stones. It had become a lesson etched into memory, a truth carved into the very soul of Israel. Soldiers who had once trembled now moved with purpose. Villagers emerged from their homes, whispering the tale to children who clutched their ears in wonder. Mothers hummed songs, fathers retold the account with awe, and the young repeated every detail as though it were legend already made. And at the center of it all stood David, the boy who had trusted where others feared. He had not wielded a sword in pride. He had not charged for glory. He had listened, obeyed, and acted. One stone placed with faith had toppled what countless warriors had feared to face. The lesson was simple, and yet profound. Faith outweighs size. Obedience overcomes terror. The stone that struck Goliath's forehead had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol. It was the moment when the impossible became real, when the mountain of bronze and muscle fell to a boy who carried trust in his heart. And from that stone, a lesson rippled outward like waves across a still lake. No giant, no fear, no obstacle is too great for a heart that trusts God. David walked through the valley, his feet brushing the dust, his eyes scanning the soldiers who now followed him with awe and respect. He did not boast, he did not claim credit. His gaze rested on the horizon, on the mountains beyond, on the future he could not yet see. And yet in every step there was quiet certainty, a knowledge that what had happened here was not chance, not skill, but divine purpose. Across the hills, the Philistines regrouped far beyond the valley, trembling at the loss of their champion. Their power had been shattered, their fear now mingled with disbelief. They had trusted size and strength, strategy and armor, but none of it could stand against the hand of God working through obedience and faith. This was a truth that would echo through generations. The God who delivers moves where hearts trust, not where armies fear. Even King Saul, watching from his hill, could not deny it. Awe and unease mingled within him as he observed the people rallying around David. This boy had rewritten what Israel believed about courage and power. Saul's crown rested heavier on his head, not with authority, but with realization. Leadership was not defined by fear or sword alone. Faith could shift the balance of nations. Courage could come from the smallest, most overlooked of places. David's victory was more than personal, it was national. The story of a shepherd defeating a giant became the story of Israel itself. It spoke to the soldiers who had doubted, to the people who had prayed in silence, to every heart that had ever faced what seemed impossible. It reminded them that courage begins not in strength, but in faith, that obedience is stronger than pride, that God's power works through those who trust, not those who rely on themselves. Even years later, the memory of that day would inspire songs, prayers, and stories. The stone that fell from David's sling became a symbol of divine justice and faith made real. Every retelling carried the weight of the lesson. No giant stands beyond the reach of God. Not pride, not terror, not overwhelming odds. Nothing can withstand the hand of the Lord acting through faith-filled obedience. As the sun sank low in the sky, casting long shadows across the Valley of Elah, Israel looked different. The people's hearts had shifted. Fear had been replaced by hope. Despair had been replaced by trust. And through one boy's courage, a nation had learned the truth that kings and soldiers, warriors and shepherds alike would carry for generations, that God delivers. David did not need monuments. He did not need accolades. His fame was not for self, but for God. The story of his victory, written in stone and carried in song, became a lesson that outlived armies, outlasted kings, and outshone the grandeur of the battlefield. Even the smallest among them could see it. The strength of God was unmatched. The courage of the faithful could bend the impossible to their side, and the valley that had once held its breath for fear now held its song for hope. In the end, the lesson was clear. Trust in the Lord, obey his word, and no giant, no terror, no mountain, no impossible obstacle can stand in your way. And as Israel celebrated and the songs rose into the twilight sky, David remained humble, a shepherd standing in the shadow of God's greatness, knowing the battle was not his, but the victory, and the lesson belonged to the Lord.